All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk, Composer 101 here at NEDCamp. I'm excited to be here. I hope you are as well. I hope your first round of sessions went well and you learned something, and I hope you learned something today at my session. Where's my mouse? There it is. Okay, so let's first talk about who I am. My name's not on the slide. That's why I don't user test.
Your name is Mike.
My name is Mike. Yes, my name is Mike Miles. I've been working with Drupal for the past decade. I do a lot with Drupal. I am one of the co-organizers of NEDCamp. I am also the lead organizer of the Boston Drupal meetup. We meet the first Tuesday of every month, so you should come check us out if you're in the Boston area or from the New England area. We have people from New Hampshire come down and people from Rhode Island come up. So check that out. So during the day, I am the VP of technology for a digital marketing agency called Genuine. So Genuine is not a development shop. It's not a Drupal shop. We're a full-service digital agency, and we make agile brands that consumers love, and we help our clients reach their users. We do that through all our in-house services. We have in-house video production, digital and traditional. We have digital strategy teams, designers, UX teams, interactive application team that builds like touch screens and kiosks and cool stuff like that. And then the development department that I lead, which has a bunch of specialties. So we have people who focus on .NET technologies, people who focus on front-end technologies, and then people who focus on PHP technologies. Majority of the time, that's Drupal. So we have offices in Boston, San Francisco, New York, and Chicago. So check us out at We Are Genuine for some of our work. At night, I run a podcast called Developing Up, which is focused on the non-technical side of being a developer. So anything you need to know about having a career in development that doesn't have to do with writing code. It's not just me telling you what to do. I talk with other developers and get real-life experience and insights. So we're just about to finish up season 2 of the podcast. So you should check it out. We just had an episode come out last week about team communication and how to do that. So that's available at developingup.com. If you want to know any more about me, you can find me online at MikeMiles86. Twitter, LinkedIn, Drupal.org, anywhere you see that handle, that's usually me, unless you don't agree with what was said, then that was somebody else. All right, so I want to start off by talking about developers, those cool people who make things happen that are, I think, very talented, very awesome people. And developers, what they like to do, and we're going to focus on PHP developers, is solve problems by writing code, right? The developer has no problem being given a business problem that needs to be solved, writing functionality that does that, and potentially writing a lot of code that solves that problem. This is what a developer does, whether it's through a GUI or through writing actually lines of code. In PHP, especially with open source, developers, we're inherently lazy. And what I mean with that is we don't like to reinvent the wheel, so people like to use third-party code. So if you see someone already wrote a library that does something you need, you're going to use that instead of writing it yourself. And developers don't mind doing this. You wish you were clever enough to have it to write it, first person to think of the problem. But you're okay with adding that third-party code to your project so that you can use it and benefit from it. It goes with the territory. But what developers don't like as much, but they manage, is when then you have third-party library you want to use that also has a dependency on a third-party library. Or you have two libraries you want to use that have the same dependency, maybe on a different version. Developers don't like this because at this point, they start having to focus on maintaining code they don't control and making sure it works, as opposed to writing code that delivers value for their project. And don't get me started when then all of a sudden you have a security update. You have to check it and check it through the stack to make sure everything still works. You've updated all the versions of everything. Oh my God, developers don't want to spend their days doing this. They want to be on the left side of the diagram writing code, not on the right side of the diagram maintaining code. And developers don't like this, and I'm also going to say that teams and organizations don't like this either. And that's because every project, whether you're working for something for your organization, you're working on client-based work, every project has some sort of limit in time and budget. And for a developer and for a team, what this means is the more third-party code you're using, the more time and budget you're spending on maintaining code instead of delivering some sort of value to your client or to your organization. You're not spending the time writing the code that you control that separates and differentiates your product. So you want to eliminate that. You want your developers, or you want to be a developer who spends time writing that code that matters and not maintaining code that you don't control. And this is where Composer comes into place. Composer is a PHP project manager. It handles managing all those dependencies for you, for your developers, for your team, so you can spend your time building what delivers value instead of maintaining code. So what I want to talk about today is three main things around Composer. First, I want to explain a little bit more the benefits of using Composer and what that does for your development team, for your project, for your organization. I want to outline the typical structure you'll see for a Composer-based project and how that gets set up and how you get Composer set up. And then the meat of this talk is the basics of Composer and the 5 commands. There are only 5 Composer commands that you need to know to be able to use Composer successfully. And by the end of this talk, I hope you're going to understand those 5 commands and be able to use them on any PHP project going forward, whether it's Drupal, Laravel, Symfony, probably WordPress as well. You'll have the knowledge of knowing these basic commands that will let you do whatever you want with Composer. And then from there on, you can build more of your knowledge. So let's get back into our happy developers who like to write code and solve problems. Like I said before in the other diagram, they don't want to spend all their time maintaining code. So instead of spending their time looking at their libraries, making sure they're in the right places and their dependencies are in place, with Composer, your developers just have to talk to Composer through some commands and say, hey, Composer, I want to use this package. Can you find it for me? Can you take care of it for me? And Composer's like, no problem. I'm going to find those packages. I'm going to find their dependencies. I'm going to make sure the dependencies are in sync, the right versions are installed. If you tell me, I'm going to update them for security purposes. So it abstracts all that maintenance time, and I'm going to say it automates it, but it's still a manual automation because you have to type commands. But it removes that burden from your development team. They get to focus on everything before Composer, which is your custom code and not the third-party code. So Composer gets in the way, in a good way, to then manage everything for your team so that they can just focus on what they need to build and deliver value. A typical Composer project is structured like this. Composer has what I like to call 3.5 components to it for a project, and I'll get into why it's 3.5 in a moment. But you have the composer.var. Composer itself is a PHP executable file, so it has a .var PHP archive file. That can be in your project root. It has a JSON file, a lock file, and a vendor directory. I'm going to talk about all these things throughout this talk. And then you have everything else, and everything else depends on what framework you're using. So for Drupal, that would be everything related to Drupal, your modules, your themes, etc. For other projects, it's anything else that you need for your project to work. Well, you'll see this structure for any project that uses Composer. You may see a variation that's a little more secure, which is where you have your everything else in a web root that is on the same level as the Composer stuff. So for Drupal, this is the doc root, for example. And the reason why you see this and why this is more secure is because if your server is delivering everything from the web root, that means no users can access anything about your Composer information. The vendor directory is what actually holds the third-party libraries that you're going to be having Composer download for you. It means nobody can access that vendor directory, and if they know there's a security loophole, trigger some sort of command that then gives them backdoor access to your system or anything like that. So by having Composer on your project root and then everything else about your project in some sort of separate web root below that, just protects your Composer information from the world so no one can use that to be malicious. So this is the typical structure, but to set up a Composer project, you need Composer. That makes sense. So first thing let's talk about is how you install Composer. This isn't a Composer command. This is just a workflow that explains how you get Composer on your system. So this is, like I said, it's the .var file. Composer is a PHP executable. And the way you get it depends on your system and your preferences. So if anyone here is on a Windows machine, the Get Composer website, which is the website for Composer, so it's getcomposer.org, has an executable file you can download. It will run you through the setup of Composer on your Windows system, and it'll set up Composer globally for your system. I'm going to explain the differences between globally and per project in a moment. So it's an easy file, step-by-step thing. Make sure you have the right permissions set up. Make sure you have all the right tools on your system, like PHP running, so that you can use it in your Windows environment. For any other system, Linux, Unix, and OS X, I think there is an executable you can download to help you guide you through setting it up. but they recommend going to the /download page, which that page has 4 PHP commands you have to run in your terminal to download and install Composer. And that's something we'll be looking at in a moment in a live demo. There's one of two ways to install Composer on your system, globally or per project. So this is why I say a Composer project has 3.5 items, because the .var file can live one of 2 places. If you leave it in your project, you leave the .var file in your project directory, you add it to your Git repo if you're using Git for code management. And the benefit of this is then Composer is part of your project. So any new people you have join your team, any system you're using to run Composer commands is going to use the same exact version of Composer. It removes that problem of saying, it worked on my machine, or I have a different version than you have. It just removes those variables. The drawback of that is that you need someone to be in charge of setting up Composer when you set up your project to make sure they put it into the project, as well as typing out Composer commands in the command line has like 8 extra characters that you have to type. That's not that big of a burden, but those microseconds add up, I guess. Globally is where you place the Composer executable in a place on your system that is globally accessible through some sort of terminal-like keyword, or keyword is not the right term. You can still access it from your terminal anywhere in your system. The benefit of this is you only have to install Composer once on your machine. The drawback of this is that everyone is responsible for installing Composer on their machines. So anytime you have a new developer join up, one of the tasks they have to do is get Composer installed on their machine or have someone do it for them. This also leads to the problem of people having different versions of Composer depending when they install it. And projects that maybe you worked on a year ago with one version of Composer and you update Composer on your machine, now are using a different version of Composer, which again could cause discrepancies. There's no right or wrong way to do this. It depends on your team's preference and your workflow. I typically go with the global, actually, even though it's more burden, but that's because it makes it easy to switch between projects and just run Composer commands. So let's take a look at installing Composer. I'm going to show you both per project and globally. And since I'm on a Mac, I'm not on Windows, I am on a Mac, I'm going to show you the Mac commands. So the Composer website, this is the /download page. You'll see there's this box here that has 4 commands in it. And all you have to do is copy and paste these into your terminal. And Composer recommends... What's that?
Because they're long.
Yeah, because they're long. And Composer recommends you do this because as versions of Composer change, the second command is actually checking a hash value for the setup code, making sure that you have a valid install. So I'm going to copy this, and in my command line, I'm just going to paste it. Oh, just by the way, I am in a project directory that has no code in it. It's just empty.
So for Windows, though, do we need to install exe first?
On Windows, instead of doing these commands, you just download that exe and you just run that instead.
But you said that you install globally, not for the demo.
I'm going to do both for the demo. Right now, I'm going to show you how to install on your project. So I am in a project directory right now called C101D for demo. And it's empty, except I just ran the command to download the setup file, which it placed into this project. So that's the first command. The second one, now this will hash that file it just downloaded, and it's going to check it against a hash value. And what it will do is you see it says installer verified. So it'll check the hash. If it matches, it says it's verified. That's the setup file you need. If it wasn't, it would say it's corrupt, and it would delete that file. And so then you would know you copied, somehow you got the wrong file. So after that's done, and it's verified, then you just run the setup command, the setup file, with php composer setup.php. So a requirement of this is you have to be able to run PHP commands from your terminal. And what this is going to do, this is going to check your system to make sure you have everything you need to run Composer. Basically, it's checking the version of PHP you have installed. It requires, I think, at least 5 point something, 5.3 probably. If your system didn't have everything needed, it would tell you what's missing and what you need to do. But this works, so now I have the .var file in my project, so I'm going to list out. So you see I have the setup.php file, and now I have composer.var. And the last command here is just to clean up and get rid of that setup file. It's no longer needed because it was just helping me get that archive. So I'm going to run that. And now my project directory just has composer up far. So at this point, I have composer installed on my project. I could commit this to a Git repository, push it up. Anyone who pulls down my project code will have the same version of composer that I installed. And I can run composer commands now by doing php composer.var. And you're going to see it gives me all these commands. This is composer, all the composer commands. Where's my mouse? So it says composer installed. Great. So that's per project. Now, if I wanted to instead have it globally on my system, I could follow the same steps. If you're on Windows, you just run the executable, and it'll do it for you. All I have to do now is move this FAR file into a globally accessible location on my machine. So I'm just going to use the move command and move it to user local bin is a good one. Bin, and I'm going to call it composer. Composer. So now my project directory is empty because I moved that executable file. But now I can just type composer. And I still have all the composer commands, right? Because it's in a globally accessible location, so I can run it. I can move out of this directory, and I can type composer, and I still have access to composer. So now I'm able to have composer on my system once. I can move between projects and use it. Again, it depends on your team and your preferences where you want to keep it. I'm going to keep it globally for now, for the rest of this demo. All right. Great. So we have Composer installed. Now we want to start using it. At the root of Composer on your Composer project is a .json file. This is a JSON schema file that you can write yourself if you know how to do so. It's not that difficult. It's basically an object with parameters. However, Composer can generate it for you. This is where you can start using Composer for your benefit, because it's going to take out that manual task from your developers, and it's going to help automate it and make sure that process is smooth. This JSON file, which I'll go through these things in a moment, but it just has some metadata about your project, so like the project name, the description, a list of authors, so your developers who are working on it. The most important thing is it has an array of required. This is an array that lists out the third-party libraries your project depends on. And we'll talk about how that gets filled out in a little bit. And then it can contain other information that's not required, but it's helpful if you want it, which we'll go through in a moment. So the way you can use Composer to generate the composer.json file is with the init command. This is going to be an interactive guide for generating that file. So let's do that. So I type composer init. And so now see, it's going to start asking me questions about my project. First thing, it's going to ask me what my project name is. It recommends it being vendor, then the project name, and it'll default it to your logged in username and the directory name. Since I work in an agency, what I like to do is keep this structured as the client name and the project name. So for example, here would be NedCamp, Composer 101. It's going to ask for a description. This is metadata that's useful for your team to understand this project. This is the demo project for NedCamp. It's going to ask for authors. It's going to pull your logged in users information. I'm just going to skip this for now and not add any more. It's going to ask for minimum stability. So what this will do is you can tell Composer what versions of code for third-party packages you're willing to accept. If you leave it blank, Composer will only ever install any version of a package that is stable, that's a stable release. I recommend keeping it that way, and we'll talk about how you can get around that for certain circumstances. But you could say, I want development versions, alpha versions, beta versions. I recommend leaving it blank so it only use stable versions. Then it's going to ask for your project type. For this purpose, it's going to be project. There's other things. Composer can be used to generate Composer libraries, Composer plugins, so it gives you a bunch of options. But for our purposes, we just need to say project. And then it's going to ask for your license. This is, again, just metadata that's helpful for your team. So if you're using the MIT license or the GNU public license, you can just list it here so it's part of your project so people know. I'll leave that blank for now. It's going to ask you if you want to install dependencies. And I'm going to, by default, it's going to assume yes, you do. And this is where you can start searching for packages you want to add to your project. But for now, I'm going to say no because we're going to go through that in a separate process. It'll also ask you, you can use Composer to install libraries that you're only going to use in your development environment, called your required dev array. I'm going to say no to this as well, just because we don't need that for now. All right, so after all that, it's going to show you the JSON that it's going to generate. It's going to ask you to confirm that this is what you want. It's got my name, the project description, the project type, me as an author, and an empty array of the packages I require because I haven't specified any. So I'm going to say, yes, this is good. This is just because I'm using a Git repository for now, so we're going to ignore this for now. And now, my project directory has a composer.json file in it. If we take a look at this, you're going to see it's exactly what it said it was going to generate. So it just helped me, guide me through that, so I didn't have to build this JSON by hand. I didn't have to worry about making a mistake. So it just helps me. So great. We have Composer installed. We have it ready to go. It's initialized for our project. What we need to start doing now is adding third-party libraries, telling Composer I want to use other packages to benefit my project. How do you do this? More importantly, how does Composer know where to find packages when you tell it you want to use them? This is where repositories come into play. So repositories are listed in your composer.json file. If you don't specify any, I'm going to show you how to specify some in a moment, but if you don't specify any separate repositories by default, Composer is going to look on Packagist at packagist.org. Packagist is the official Composer package website that keeps track of all PHP projects and libraries that are available on Composer. So you can come to this website, packagist.org. You can search for packages based by keywords, get descriptions, find out information, see if it works for your project. You can do that here. But not everything is listed here, and you may have libraries and code that you want to include on your project that are not available on Packagist. For example, in Drupal 8 or in Drupal, modules aren't listed on Packagist because Drupal has its own Packagist repository. So if you wanted to use Composer for Drupal, you would have to specify in your composer.json a repositories array of objects that basically tell the type of repository you want to look for and the URL of it. There's two types of repositories. One is of type Composer, which Packagist itself is open source, so you can set up your own personal Packagist library, which is what Drupal did, and that's the type Composer, and the URL to it. So for Drupal, that's packages.drupal.com/8 for Drupal 8. But you can also use any sort of repository for Composer. So for example, if you have code that you typically can put on all your projects that you want to reuse, that you have in a GitHub repo or a Bitbucket repo, you can add those as type VCS for a version control system, and you can list it in your repositories array. So when you tell Composer, I require this package with this name, it'll look at your own repository as well. These can be private. I'm not going to get into how you can add like authentication tokens and stuff, but you can do that. There's more information on the Git Composer website that's more advanced. But so this allows you to add anything that's version controlled as a library to your project. So if you can't find it on Packagist, you can set it up as a repository. All right, so now Composer knows where to look for things. If you don't specify anything separate, it's going to just look on Packagist. Great. How do you start telling Composer, I want a package for my project? I require third-party code for my project. This is the require command. So Composer require. When you run this command, it affects three things of your Composer project. It's going to add the package that you define to your composer.json with a version string so that it can keep track of it because you said I require this. It's going to create a lock file, which I think of the lock file as like the brains of Composer. It's a file generated for Composer by Composer that keeps track of all the packages it's installed for you and all their dependencies. And then it's going to affect the vendor directory. The vendor directory is where Composer downloads all the third-party code and stores it. So when you say I require a package, when it downloads that package code, it's going to put it in vendor. The require command can be run one of three ways, just as require, which will give you an interactive guide. You can provide the package name, which will download the latest version of that package, or you can give it a specific version of a package you want, and it will get that specific version. So let's take a look at these three and how we do it. So back to my command line. If I just say composer require, it's going to say search for a package. It's basically asking me for a keyword. Since I am a good PHP developer, I'm going to make sure this project has logging on it so I can log errors and things that happen in my system. So I'm going to search for log. What this is doing is it makes a call to packagist, says give me a list of packages that have the word log in it, and it's going to return an array to give me options to choose from. If I didn't want to use any one of these, I could go on the packages website myself, find the name of the package, and provide it here at this little prompt. But we're going to use, let's say we'll use monolog, which is a well-known PHP logging library. I just have to hit the number from the array, hit enter. It's going to ask me, is there any specific version of this project that I want to use? Let's say I want to use version 1.20, for example. I can specify that here. If I don't specify anything, it's going to give me the latest version of it. Then it's going to ask me to search for more packages, but we're only going to do one for now. So now what it's doing is Composer will, now that it knows what package I want and what version, it's going to update my composer.json file with that information, which I'll show you. It's then going to make a call to packagist to get that project and any of its information, and then it's going to download the code for that and its dependencies. So what you'll see here is package operations, 2 installs. So I actually installed 2 libraries. The only thing I told it I wanted was monolog, which you see from the second line of installing. But monolog had a dependency on another package on log. So it first downloaded that for me. So Composer already has determined the library you're requiring has its own dependencies, and I'm going to make sure I download those as well. It took care of that for me. So now in my project directory, we see I have my composer.json, a generated composer.log file, and a vendor directory. And if we look at our JSON file, you're going to see that my require array now has monolog version 1.2 in it. That's the version I told it I wanted. It added it so I can keep track of it. What Composer also generated is that lock file. So go on composer.lock. And you're going to see this file has a lot more stuff in it, right? A lot of stuff. Like I said, this file is generated by Composer for Composer's use. It's not for people to touch. And it keeps track of all the packages it installs. The ones you say you require, their dependencies, how those dependencies cross with each other. So see on line 10, like it has the version, it has the monolog package, the specific version it downloaded, which is 1.20.0, where it downloaded from, so it's from a GitHub repo, the commit that it downloaded from, and then as well as on line 23, you're going to see the requirements for using this package. So that requires a version of PHP, and it requires the PSR log package, which then further down, you're going to see on line 88, it downloaded the log package and has all its information as well. This information about PSR log is not in my composer file, .json file, right? All I have is monolog here because I was telling Composer, I care about this package. I don't care about anything else that package depends on. Composer's going to take care of that for me. I don't have to know about it. So a big important thing about the lock file, like I said, is you do not edit the lock file. If you do, you're going to have a bad time. It's generated for Composer, by Composer, for Composer, not for you to meddle with. If you do change it, it's not the end of the world. It's easy enough to fix, but I recommend just not editing it. And the other thing, when we ran that require command, that happened. We have our vendor directory. So if I look in vendor, you're going to see there's a bunch of directories in here. This is all the third-party code that Composer has downloaded. So you see monolog, you see PSR. And the way Composer organizes these is by vendor name and then package name. That's because a vendor could have multiple packages, and we'll see that in a little bit. Important thing to state about the vendor directory is that if you're using version control like Git, you do not commit the vendor directory to your repository. The reason for this is I'm a strong advocate to believe that the only thing in your repository should be the code that you control that you can edit. You're not going to edit those third-party libraries. If your vendor directory is in your repo, you're taking control of those. You are kind of handcuffing Composer from what it can do, and you're also making it hard on your team when you update a package or install a package and you create a pull request, and people see all this third-party code that then they have to do I have to read this? Do I have to understand what's in it? So I recommend keeping the vendor directory out of repo. obviously, you need the code that's in that directory to use the packages. So you can just have your composer install command, which we're going to go through next, install those packages on your other people's machines, or using like some sort of build service to build your code for you on your server and whatnot. All right, so that was composer require. Let's look at it with a package name. And this is very similar to what we just did. I'm going to say composer require. And now let's say I also want to write unit tests for my code that I write. So I'm going to say PHP unit. I know this is the vendor package name because I've done this enough times. This is where, if you're not sure what to type here, you're going to look on packages.org yourself. And when I run this, what composer is going to do is it's going to assume I want the latest version of that package. It's going to get it. It says using version 5.7. And it's going to install that and all of its dependencies. Look at all those dependencies PHP unit has. If I wasn't using Composer, I would have to know where to install these and how to organize them. I don't have to worry about that. Less interactive than just without the package name, but still helpful. So now, if I look in vendor, you're going to see there's a lot more code in here, right? A lot more projects that I have no idea or purview into, and I don't need to, because Composer cares about it for me. All right, and the final way is with a version number. And Packages uses semantic versioning, which is major.minor.patch to keep track of things. And there's different constraints that you can tell Composer that you want to use when installing a package. You can be very specific and say, I want version like 1.0.1, and it's going to get that specific version. You can say, I want to use comparison operators to do a range. So I want any version, the latest version of the package that is at least version 1.0, but less than version 2.0. So anything that's below the next significant release. You can use stars for wildcards to say, I want whatever the latest patch version is, so version 1.0.star. You'll find the latest version that matches that pattern. You can use tildes, which are similar to doing those comparison operators. The tilde 1.0 says the same exact thing as greater than or equal to 1.0 but less than 2. So this is just saying, tilde says anything, the latest version that's less than the next significant release. And then, if you need to, you can pass stability flags. You'll see this happen a lot when you use Composer for Drupal, because for Drupal 8, for example, there's a lot of modules out there that still are in alpha and beta. So if you want to get those, but Composer's like, I'm only going to install stable packages, you can pass like @dev or @alpha, @beta. And you're telling Composer, I know I want stable, but for this instance, give me something that's not stable. All right, so let's look at this last version of using require. I'm going to go back to my command line, clear it. And now I have PHP unit testing. For my code testing, let's test user behaviors. I'm going to install bhat. So I'm going to say composer require bhat. And now I can give it a version constraint. So I'm going to say 3.3.star. So what I'm telling here is I want whatever version of bhat is less than version 3.4. Give me the latest version that matches that. So when I run this, Composer is going to check packages, see if you can find package that matches that, update my composer.json, and then download bhat for that version and any of its dependencies. You can see it installs a lot. What you can see towards the top here is the version of bhat installed was version 3.3.1. That was the version that matched. That's less than 3.4. All right, great. So now we have, we've told Composer what packages we want for our project using the require command. Next, you want to have other people on your project or your servers or wherever to have that third-party code. But how do you do that when you don't commit the vendor directory, where all the third-party code lives? This is where the Composer install command is used. So install is going to read from your lock file, and it's going to download all the packages that are defined in there and install them in the vendor. So it makes it so you don't have to commit vendor because you just have anybody run Composer install when they have your repo, and Composer is going to download all the code for them, and they'll have the versions you want. Now, there's a thing that happens depending on if you have your lock file or not. Some people don't include their lock files in their repositories for whatever reason. And what happens here is if you don't have your lock file, and you run composer install, it's going to read from your .json file, which could have that string that has wildcards. So it's going to get whatever latest version matches that package string, that version string. The downfall of this, the caveat of this, what's the word I want? Yeah, whatever. You know what? Caveat is that depending when someone runs composer install, they're going to have a different version of the package than you had downloaded if you don't have a lock file, because it's going to download whatever matches that constraint string. Your lock file, composer says the specific major.minor.patch version that it installed. It has no variables to it. So when someone runs composer install and you have a lock file, you know that everyone's going to get the same exact version of those packages. It's going to remove those variables from your team and from your project. So I recommend committing your composer.lock file to your code repo so you know whenever somebody runs composer install, they're going to get the same version of the code that you're using. Your server's going to have the same version of code you're running, and you don't have to worry about that problem. So let's look at what happens when we run composer install. You can only run it one way, by saying composer install. To do this, I'm going to do something a little goofy, because I already have a vendor directory. I'm going to delete it. So right now, my project only has composer.json and composer lock. This is like if I was a new person on the team, I downloaded the project repo. These are the only two files I see. So if I want that third-party package code, I run composer install. Did I type it right? Yeah. So this is going to read from my lock file and download all the code for me. Put it all in the vendor directory. So you see I have vendor now. And it installed them all. Very quick. I didn't have to worry about setting that up. Being a junior person on the team, not knowing where to put things, Composer handled it for me. All right. So that's great. That's how you use install to make sure everyone on your team has a third-party code that's not in your repo. But what happens when there is a security update? What happens when you want to use a different version of a package? This is where you use the composer update command, the fourth command we're talking about. Update is going to read from composer.json to check your version constraint strings. It's going to check your repositories to see if there's any version that matches that string that's greater than the version it's already installed. And if so, it's going to download and install it. It's going to update your lock file information. It's going to update the vendor code. You can run update one of two ways. If you just say composer update, it's going to try to update all your packages, which you may want to do, you may not. If you want to only update a certain package, you can provide the vendor package name that you want to update. For example, in the world of Drupal, if you have a module you're using that has a security update, you may not want to update all your modules or update Drupal core, so you say composer update Drupal / whatever the module name is. And it'll just update that module. So I'm going to show these two, starting with showing how to update a single package and then how to update everything. So let's go. I have to do another goofy thing here. Because we have bhat, we have the latest version that matches this constraint. I'm going to change my constraint for bhat to be tilde 3.3. So this is telling Composer, I'm now going to want any version of bhat that is less than version 4, basically, but it's at least version 3. So now if I have this saved and I now type composer update bhat. So the version of bhat right now that's installed, to remind you, is version 3.3.1. When I run this with my constraint string changed to say I want anything that's less than version 4 of bhat, Composer is going to check package, see what versions are out there that are greater than 3.3.1 and get me the latest one. And it's going to update it and update all the code in my vendor directory that's related to that. So you'll see it's updated it to version 3.5. It updates my lock file and it updates my vendor directory. Now, going back to my demo, my code, if I wanted to just run composer update and have it update everything in my repo, all my third-party code, I'm going to make another change here. Since we have monologue very specific, let's use comparison operators to say I need to put that in quotes. Anything that's greater than or equal to version 1.20, which I have installed, but less than version 2.0. Right? So I want anything that's the latest version of monologue that's less than version 2. So with that saved, when I run now just composer update without saying a package, Composer is going to read from composer.json, go through each one of these packages, and find out if any of them have a newer release. And for us, it should find that Monologue has a later release, and it's going to download that and update it. Yes?
I'm sorry if I missed this already.
No problem.
But, so it's not an automatic update. It's when the developer goes in and says, look for updates.
Yes,
right?
correct.
And you know, what, is there a best practices for that? Like, do you hear about it and that's why you do it, or?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what frameworks and libraries you're using. I would hope your developers, like for Drupal, you're on like the security newsletters that you say like these projects have security updates, and you run it from there. What I like to do is if you work in like a sprint style, like agile style, you have like 2-week sprints for releases. Right after I do a release, the first next step is to run composer update to see what updates have to happen. And then that gives me till the next release to smooth out any issues with running those updates. So if you make it part of your regular practice, one, if you do get alerts for whatever packages you're using that there's a security update, you do it then. But if you just make it part of your workflow, that at some point someone is responsible for running composer update.
And those other people, so they can do that update in a silo, more or less, because they've put it up in the repo.
Right.
Right? So somebody now getting onto their machine hasn't talked to that person yet. They're going to know that it needs to be updated, or it has to be communication?
No, so it doesn't have to be communication at all. Ideally it is, but here's why. Because if you keep your lock file in your repo, the lock file says the specific version of a package, the major.minor.patch.
Oh, so it's updated when developer 1 did it?
Right, so you have someone who's in charge of running the updates. They run composer update, gets the latest version. You don't have vendor directory checked in, so none of the code has to change. It's just that lock file that changes.
Okay.
You push that up. Now the next developer who downloads those updates, if they run composer install, composer's going to see the lock file change, and it's going to update the vendor code. So you have one person who runs composer update at some set point, and they're in charge of making sure the projects the code is up to date and you have the latest versions. I like to rotate that throughout the team because it gives everyone experience to do it. All right, so we'll see here that Monologue was updated to version 1.24 without me saying the package name. So great. So we can install packages using the install command. We can keep them up to date by running the update command. What happens when you find a package is no longer useful? You don't want to use it. Maybe you were testing a Drupal module that's not going to meet your needs, and you want to get rid of it and any of its dependencies. This is the remove command. You can type composer remove, and what this will do is it's going to remove the information about that package from your JSON file. It's going to remove the information about that package from your lock file. It's going to delete the code from the vendor directory. It's also going to check to see if that package has any other dependencies that become abandoned and delete those as well. So it does really good at garbage collection, so it doesn't leave any abandoned dependencies in your code base. The only way to run composer remove is by giving it a package name. If you just say composer remove, it's going to give you an error because it is protecting itself from deleting everything. So you have to say specifically what package you want to remove. So for example, let's say the package we have set up right now, the project we have set up, that we don't need PHP unit anymore for whatever reason. I can say composer remove PHP unit / PHP unit. And what it's going to do, it's going to, one, remove the line about PHP unit from my composer.json. It's going to check the lock file to cross-check all the dependencies that PHP unit has. And see how much code it deleted? Those are all third-party libraries that only the PHP unit needed that were in my code base that no other third-party code needs. So it's going to remove all that stuff for me. It's going to update my lock file. And then you'll see my vendor directory has a lot less stuff in it, as well as my .json file no longer lists PHP unit. Delete it from there for me. So again, this is something where anyone could run the remove command, and it'll update the lock file that they then commit back up, and when people run install, it's going to see that there's abandoned code, and it should get rid of it. So, great. Now what? You can use install, require to find packages, install to install them, update to update them, remove to get rid of ones you don't want to use. But how do you actually use that code? You have no purview really into the vendor directory. You don't know how it's structured. You don't know what code is in there really, except for the packages you said you wanted. So how can you actually use it in your custom code? This is where a handy feature of Composer is it generates an autoload.php file. This is structured to use PSR for autoloading, which means if you include this autoload file in your custom code, and then you instantiate an object from one of your third-party libraries, that autoload file is going to know where to find that code and make sure it's included. So the way you do this, for example, we have that logging directory, that logging project we downloaded. We want to use that in our custom code. On my PHP code here, I just say I require the vendor autoload file, because I know that's there. And then I can start saying I want to use a monologue logger, and then I can start using logging. I don't have to do the require vendor /monologue/monologue/ whatever I would need to include. The autoload.php is going to handle that for me through magic. So now your team is free to focus on writing this code, including autoload, and then using any of that third-party packages that they downloaded. If you're using Drupal and Composer with Drupal, Drupal helps with this as well, and it has an autoload file that it'll use. And so it removes that burden from you from figuring out where the code lives. All right, I just went over a lot of information. So I want to recap it a little bit. Composer manages your project dependencies for you. It saves that burden from your team so they can focus on writing the code that delivers value to your project or your clients and not spending their time and your budget for maintaining third-party code that you don't control, that you want to use. You can install Composer per project by keeping the .var file in your project directory, put it in a global location. Benefits, caveats to either approach depends on your team and what you want to do. The major parts of any Composer project that relates to Composer is the .json file, which has your dependency information for the libraries that you require and the metadata of your project. The .lock file, which Composer uses to keep track of everything it is maintaining for you. And then the vendor directory that has the vendor code in it. And then the 5 commands. These are the 5 commands you need to know to be able to use Composer successfully. Is the init to generate that JSON for you, the require to find packages that you want to use, the the install to download that third-party code into your project, the update command to keep packages up to date, and then the remove command to get rid of them. And then you don't need to know where Composer keeps these files besides it's in vendor. You can use the /autoload.php file to then be able to access that code and use those objects. Even with this recap, I know it was a lot of information, so I have some resources. This first bit.ly link, bit.ly/Ned Composer, is this presentation annotated, as well as with screen recordings of all the commands I ran and explanations of what's happening exactly in all of those commands. So it gives you more information about the commands I ran and how they work. I have a blog post at bit.ly/mastercomposer, which talks about those 5 commands you need to know a little more in detail, so if you can get more background on those. The Get Composer website at getcomposer.org has lots of documentation and information to further your understanding and education on Composer. Packages.org, where you can go to find PHP libraries that you can use with Composer. And then, since we're at a Drupal conference, to get started with Composer and your Drupal projects, I recommend drupal-composer.org, which gives you information on how to set up Composer for Drupal. It provides a way to get scaffolding that's already in place, so it does more advanced things like downloads your modules into the module directory instead of the vendor directory. And it's a lot more specific to Drupal. So with that, I want to first thank you for coming to my talk. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming to NedCamp, spending your Saturday. If you have any feedback for me, talk to me now or later. Send me a message. Let me know how I can make this better. And we have a couple minutes for questions, this is the end of the presentation, so I'll put back up the resources slide. And does anyone have any questions?
Could you talk a little bit more about autoload?
Sure.
Just, you said Composer has autoload and Drupal has autoload?
Yeah, Drupal has an autoload file from Symfony framework.
Drupal 8.
Drupal 8 does, sorry, yes, I should have clarified. Drupal 7 doesn't. There are instructions online, I believe, on how you can include, like, you can add Composer for Drupal 7. There's online guides for how to do that. So the autoload file, basically, I don't know all the specifics of it, but anytime you download a package using Composer, it actually updates the autoload.php file, it regenerates it, and it keeps the path information about where the project code lives, where the vendor, or the third-party package code lives within the vendor directory. And it has methods for checking with the code you're writing if you're trying to instantiate an object, that then it can tell what code it has to include from that vendor directory. I'll be honest, I don't know all the magic format. I just know that it's magic and autoloading the files, so you don't have to say the separate require lines in PHP. So for any PHP project that you use Composer on, if you include that vendor autoload file, then you start using your objects. If you're downloading packages that don't use object-oriented code, I'm not sure how it does the functions if you're doing functional code, but I think it should work. Packages.org has more information about how to use it.
In Drupal.8, are there two different autoload functions going on, or is Drupal taking over the autoload function?
Drupal takes over the autoload function
and
for you.
And does not use the Composer.
Yeah, I don't think it does. I think there's either a way you can use multiple autoloads, or somehow it knows where to look. But with Drupal 8, for example, if you use like the Composer scaffolding project at Drupal Composer, that's going to put things in a place where Drupal knows where to find things, like put the modules in the modules directory, the themes in the themes directory.
As long as we use that.
As long as you use that, you don't have to worry about it. It's out of your hands. Kevin?
Question, yeah. So I currently have a setup because I had Composer pre-existing as a global.
Yep.
And then for your demo, I stuck it in a project. So now I have two versions of Composer installed on my machine, and you could potentially have many.
Yep.
Are there any gotchas that you're aware of in terms of updating Composer itself? You're updating the actual bar file.
Yeah, so I'll say if you have it just globally and then also per project on the same machine, you have to remember that if you want to use the version that's in that project, you have to type php composer.var, because the Composer keyword is going to use your global version. The gotcha for keeping it up to date, I would recommend, just like you have someone who keeps runs the Composer update for your packages, if you want to keep it up to date for a project, that you have someone who's in charge of doing that, and they update the FAR file. Globally, it's up to whenever the people want to update their system, which is where then you can run. I think there's like one of the commands is like you can have Composer update itself somehow.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think there's a command for that.
Cool.
So you can run that and just do it. Or you can run, like, when I run this demo, when I get my system set up, I'm always updating Composer on my machine because I'm downloading the latest version and then pushing it globally. Mm-hmm. So you can just run those 4 PHP commands or run the executable again. So the gotcha is just making sure if you have per project and global, you understand how you have to type out the command to use which version.
Gotcha. Cool. And you can do like Composer-version or dash.
Yeah, I think, so you can check it, yeah. You shouldn't have too much trouble with the different versions of Composer, but there's always that caveat, right?
Sure.
If you had version like 5 and now you're using version 7, like there may be differences, so.
Cool.
Good question.
Thank you.
On Linux, if they're trying to say, you need code updated and it wants to update Composer, is the answer yes or no? I want to keep Composer updated?
I would recommend keeping it up to date. I would just make sure that the best thing to do is make sure everyone in your team is using the same version.
As long as they're all on the same version.
Yeah, right? And as long as if you're running like any automated build processes on like servers, that they're using the same version. Like you want to keep everyone on the same version as much as possible to remove that issue of it works on my machine, right? Because if everyone's using the same version, then you should have less of those problems. Good question. Any other questions? No? Any other applause?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And I'm going to stop recording.